Can you keep the noise down? This is first class, not a nursery. I saw what happened. You leaned in. Sir, if that baby makes a mess on the upholstery, you'll be paying the cleaning fee personally.
They say power doesn't change people, it reveals them. And for Tiffany Miller, power came stitched into a navy blue uniform, polished into a silver badge, and reinforced by 20 years of seniority in the sky. At 35,000 feet, where passengers surrendered control the moment they buckled their seatbelts, Tiffany believed she was something more than an employee. She believed she was an authority, a gatekeeper, a judge. First class wasn't just a cabin to her. It was her kingdom. Every aisle, every leather seat, every hushed conversation belonged to her domain. She decided who fit and who didn't, who deserved warmth and who earned cold indifference. Over the years, that quiet authority had fermented into something uglier, entitlement wrapped in professionalism, cruelty hidden behind policy. At 42, Tiffany had long stopped loving the job. The romance of travel had faded somewhere between delayed departures and demanding passengers. What remained was bitterness. She wore it well, tucked behind a tight smile that never reached her eyes. She judged people the moment they stepped on board. Shoes first, then clothes, then skin. It was a habit, so ingrained she barely noticed herself doing it anymore. On that rainy morning at JFK International Airport, Apex Airways Flight 4002 waited at the gate, bound for London. Outside, rain lashed the runway, blurring the world into streaks of gray and steel. Inside the first-class cabin, everything was calm, quiet, controlled, just the way Tiffany liked it. She stood at the galley entrance, tablet in hand, scanning the manifest with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Names, seat numbers, loyalty statuses. Gold members, platinum members, people who mattered. That's when she saw the name, David Washington, seat 1A. A first-class seat, bulkhead, prime position. Tiffany's eyes narrowed slightly. When David boarded, carrying his 10-month-old daughter in his arms, the judgment came instantly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed casually in a charcoal hoodie and sweatpants. Comfortable, unpretentious, not what Tiffany considered first-class appropriate. Then the baby whimpered. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just the soft, uneven cry of a child who didn't feel well. But to Tiffany, it sounded like an invasion. Her lip curled, just a little. She didn't see a father juggling exhaustion and responsibility. She didn't see a man traveling alone with his infant for the first time after unimaginable loss. She didn't see grief or love or vulnerability. She saw disruption. She saw someone who, in her mind, didn't belong in her cabin. David stepped forward politely, shifting the baby to keep her secure. Tiffany didn't move out of the aisle. She planted her feet, creating a silent barrier. Boarding pass, she said flatly. No greeting, no courtesy, no acknowledgement of the child in his arms. David paused, surprised by the tone, and adjusted his grip on his daughter. Her small body radiated heat. She'd been running a fever since the night before, and every cry tightened the knot in his chest. He reached for his phone. "It's on my phone," he said quietly. As he moved, the baby cried a little louder, startled by the motion. Tiffany's patience snapped. "Can you keep the noise down?" she snapped, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This is first class, not a nursery." The words landed hard. David froze. For a brief moment, he considered responding, explaining, defending himself. But he had lived this moment before, different places, same script. He knew how quickly calm could be weaponized against him, how easily frustration could be reframed as aggression. So he swallowed it. He held his daughter closer and stayed quiet. Tiffany scanned the boarding pass, the device chiming green, valid. She shoved the phone back toward him without looking him in the eye. "Seat 1A. Don't block the aisle," she said. "And if that baby makes a mess on the upholstery, you'll be paying the cleaning fee personally." David said nothing. He stepped past her and walked into the cabin, unaware that a quiet man in seat 2B had lowered his newspaper and was watching everything with calm, focused eyes. Unaware that someone was already taking notes. Because while Tiffany believed her badge made her untouchable, she had forgotten the most dangerous truth of all. Power doesn't protect cruelty. It documents it. David Washington had never imagined his life would feel this heavy at 32. Not the kind of heavy that tired muscles or slowed steps, but the kind that pressed on the chest, that made breathing feel like work. The kind of weight grief leaves behind after it has taken everything it wanted and moved on. 6 months earlier, his world had collapsed in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. His wife, Angela, had been laughing just hours before, complaining about the cafeteria coffee, teasing him about how nervous he looked holding their newborn. Then the monitors screamed. Doctors rushed in. And just like that, laughter turned into shouting, and shouting turned into silence. A rare postpartum complication. That's what they called it. Clinical words. Clean words. Words that explained nothing. Angela never came home. Now, David traveled alone with their daughter, Maya, a child too young to understand why one parent's voice had disappeared forever. Every smile she gave him felt like a gift. Every cry felt like a reminder of how fragile everything was. The flight to London wasn't a luxury. It was necessity. Angela's mother had been begging to see Maya, to hold the piece of her daughter that still existed in the world. David had resisted at first. Traveling with a baby terrified him. Traveling alone terrified him more. But grief had already taught him something important. Waiting didn't bring people back. So he booked the ticket. First class wasn't indulgence. It was strategy. Space to hold Maya. Room to soothe her. A seat close to the front, so he could exit quickly if she became overwhelmed. David had paid every dollar himself, dipping into savings he had once imagined using for family vacations that would now never happen. As he reached seat 1A, he felt the familiar tension creeping up his spine. He could still hear the flight attendant's voice echoing in his head, sharp, dismissive, humiliating. He'd learned long ago how moments like that could spiral if handled the wrong way. David had grown up understanding that silence was sometimes safer than truth. He settled into the seat carefully, easing Maya onto his chest. She whimpered again, her tiny fingers curling into the fabric of his hoodie. He swayed gently, whispering the same soft words he had whispered during countless sleepless nights. "I've got you," he murmured. "Daddy's here." Around him, the first-class cabin filled with muted privilege. Soft laughter, clinking glasses, the rustle of expensive coats being hung with assistance. No one looked at him directly, but he felt the glances, quick, curious, and then deliberately uninterested. Except one. In seat 2B sat an older man with silver hair and a posture that spoke of discipline and control. He wore a tailored gray suit, no tie, and his expression remained neutral as he folded his newspaper and placed it on his lap. His eyes lingered on David for a second longer than necessary, not with judgment, but with attention. The man noticed the baby's flushed cheeks. He noticed the way David's hands trembled just slightly as he adjusted the blanket. He noticed the exhaustion etched into a face far too young to carry that much sorrow. David didn't know his name, didn't know that he was Arthur Sterling, a corporate governance attorney who specialized in crisis investigations. A man whose entire career revolved around observing human behavior under pressure. Arthur had seen arrogance before. He'd seen it destroy companies, careers, and lives. And he had learned to recognize it early, in clipped tones, in public corrections meant to assert dominance, in the way people used policy as a weapon rather than a guide. When the flight attendant passed again, Arthur watched closely. Tiffany slowed near David's seat, her eyes darting to the baby. The smallest frown crossed her face. She didn't say anything this time, but the message was clear. Disapproval doesn't always need words. David felt it anyway. Maya stirred in his arms, her breathing uneven. He checked her forehead with the back of his hand. Still warm. He reached into the diaper bag for the infant fever reducer, measuring the dose carefully despite the turbulence beginning to ripple through the cabin. This wasn't just a flight. It was a test of endurance. David closed his eyes for a moment, grounding himself. He reminded himself why he was here. For Angela's mother. For Maya. For the family that still needed him. What he didn't know was that the real test hadn't begun yet. Because some people mistake patience for weakness. And Tiffany Miller was about to make that mistake, publicly, recklessly, and in front of the one witness she should have feared most. The seatbelt sign chimed off with a soft electronic note, and the cabin exhaled. At cruising altitude, Apex Airways Flight 4002 settled into its long journey across the Atlantic. Lights dimmed. Curtains were drawn. First class transformed into a quiet cocoon of whispered conversations and curated comfort. For Tiffany Miller, this was the part of the flight she enjoyed most. Service. It was where her authority became visible. Where rules could be enforced, preferences denied, and power exercised under the polished excuse of professionalism. She pushed the beverage cart forward with practiced ease, her posture rigid, movements precise. When she reached seat 1A, she stopped. David looked up, already alert, already braced. Maya slept against his chest now, her breathing shallow but steady. He had finally managed to calm her after nearly 20 minutes of gentle rocking. Tiffany glanced at the sleeping baby, then at the cart. Her jaw tightened. "What would you like to drink?" she asked, her voice clipped. "Just hot water, please," David said quietly. For her bottle. Tiffany blinked. "Once. We don't provide hot water for personal use during beverage service," she replied flatly. David frowned, confused. "I've gotten it before," he said, keeping his tone calm. "It's just water." She tilted her head, the faintest smile touching her lips, the kind that wasn't warmth, but warning. "Policy," she said. "You can wait until service is complete." Maya stirred, letting out a soft cry, as if on cue. Tiffany's eyes hardened. "There are other passengers trying to enjoy their flight," she added. "You'll need to manage that." Something shifted in David's chest. "I paid for this seat," he said gently. "I'm not asking for anything extra." The cabin went still. A few heads turned. Not fully. Just enough. Tiffany straightened, her voice dropping into something colder. Louder. "Sir, if you're unhappy with our service, you're welcome to speak to customer relations after we land," she said. "But right now, you are disrupting the cabin." Arthur Sterling watched carefully from seat 2B. He saw the subtle escalation, the choice of words, the deliberate volume increase, the way Tiffany framed the interaction. This wasn't about water. It was about control. David exhaled slowly, the way his therapist had taught him. He nodded. "Okay," he said. "I'll wait." Tiffany's lips pressed together. This wasn't the reaction she wanted. She turned sharply, pulling the cart forward. But just as she did, Maya cried out, louder this time, her fever spiking, her body tensing in discomfort. The sound cut through the cabin. Tiffany stopped. She turned back. Her eyes flicked to the baby, then to the cup of steaming coffee sitting in the cart's holder. In that moment, she made a decision. Later, she would claim it was an accident, a slip, turbulence, a misunderstanding. But witnesses would remember something else. They would remember the pause, the look, the intent. Tiffany reached for the coffee, lifting it higher than necessary. As the plane hit a mild ripple of turbulence, she leaned toward David's seat, too close, too fast. The cup tilted. Scalding liquid spilled forward. It happened in less than a second. Coffee splashed across Maya's blanket, soaking through fabric, burning delicate skin. The baby's scream was immediate, raw, piercing animal. David shouted, instinct taking over. He ripped the blanket away, horrified by the angry red blooming across his daughter's leg. "What the hell?" he yelled, standing up. The cabin erupted. Passengers gasped. Someone cursed under their breath. The man across the aisle stood halfway out of his seat. Tiffany froze, then instantly recovered. "I told you to stay still," she snapped. "You moved into the cart." "That's a lie." David shouted, panic flooding his voice. "You spilled it on her." "Sir, lower your voice," Tiffany said sharply. "You're causing a disturbance." Arthur was already on his feet. "I saw what happened," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You leaned in." Tiffany turned on him, eyes blazing. "Sit down," she said. "This doesn't concern you." David held his screaming daughter, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His heart pounded as he scanned her skin, praying the burns weren't severe. "Get a medic," he demanded. "Now." Tiffany crossed her arms. "We'll handle this after the flight," she said coolly. "Right now, you need to calm down before I have you restrained." The word hung in the air. Restrained. Arthur's gaze sharpened. Because this was no longer about a crying baby. This was about a woman who believed she could hurt someone and threaten them into silence. And she had just done it in front of the wrong witness. The cabin no longer felt like first class. The illusion of luxury collapsed under the sound of a baby screaming in pain. Conversation stopped. Screens went dark. Even the soft hum of the engine seemed louder now, as if the aircraft itself sensed something had gone terribly wrong. David stood frozen in the aisle, his daughter's cries tearing through him. Her tiny leg was already swelling, the skin angry and red beneath the soaked fabric. He could barely process what he was seeing. His mind raced through every nightmare a parent could imagine, each one worse than the last. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "She's burned. She needs help." Tiffany Miller did not apologize. Instead, she shifted tactics. "Sir," she said loudly, turning toward the rest of the cabin, "you stood up during service and knocked the cart. We have procedures for situations like this." A lie delivered with confidence. Gaslighting in uniform. A few passengers exchanged uncertain looks. Doubt crept in, exactly as Tiffany intended. Authority, when spoken clearly enough, has a way of bending reality. Arthur Sterling stepped fully into the aisle. "That's not what happened," he said evenly. "You leaned into his space. I watched you lift the cup." Tiffany scoffed. "You're mistaken." "I'm not," Arthur replied. She glanced at his seat number, then dismissed him with a flick of her eyes. "Sir, sit down before you make this worse for yourself." For the first time, Arthur smiled, not with humor, but with recognition. "Interesting choice of words," he said. David dropped back into his seat, cradling Maya against his chest, rocking desperately as tears streamed down his face. He didn't care about the looks anymore. He didn't care about embarrassment. All he cared about was his child's pain and the terrifying helplessness clawing at his throat. A junior flight attendant rushed forward, her face pale. She knelt beside David, assessing the injury. "Oh my God," she whispered. "This is bad." Tiffany shot her a warning glance. "Step away. I'll handle it." The younger attendant hesitated, then stood, conflicted, silent. Arthur exhaled slowly. "You should request an immediate medical diversion," he said. "Burns on an infant are not something you handle." Tiffany's head snapped toward him. "Are you a doctor?" "No," Arthur replied. "I'm worse." That got her attention. He reached into his jacket and removed a slim leather wallet, opening it just enough for her to see the embossed credentials inside. "My name is Arthur Sterling," he said calmly. "I'm a corporate governance attorney. I specialize in federal compliance, crisis liability, and employee misconduct investigations." The color drained from Tiffany's face, just slightly. Not fear yet, but calculation. "And I suggest you stop speaking immediately," Arthur continued. "Because every sentence you're forming right now is creating a record." The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. Tiffany recovered quickly. She always did. "This is an internal matter," she said stiffly. "You have no authority here." Arthur nodded. "On the contrary, Apex Airways retains my firm for external review." Silence. Then, quietly, "This flight will divert," he added. "And when it does, the footage from at least 3 passengers who were recording will be preserved, including mine." Tiffany's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around the cabin. Phones were out now. Subtle, careful, but unmistakable. People weren't just watching anymore. They were documenting. David felt a hand on his shoulder. Arthur knelt beside him. "We're getting her help," Arthur said gently. "I promise." For the first time since boarding, David believed someone. Tiffany straightened, her authority unraveling thread by thread. "I need you to return to your seat," she said to Arthur, but her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. Arthur stood. "I will. But understand this. What happened here doesn't end in the air." Minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a medical emergency, we will be diverting to the nearest airport." A ripple moved through the cabin. Confusion, frustration, whispers. Tiffany stared straight ahead, her hands clenched at her sides. She had believed the uniform made her powerful. She had believed policy would protect her. She had believed the man in seat 1A would stay quiet. But power had shifted, and it was no longer hers. The aircraft touched down under gray skies less than 40 minutes later, tires screeching against wet asphalt as emergency vehicles lined the runway. What had begun as a routine international flight now felt like a crime scene in motion. Before the engines had even powered down, paramedics boarded. They moved fast, efficient, focused, lifting Maya gently from David's arms. The baby's cries had weakened into soft, broken whimpers, each one cutting deeper than the last. A medic examined the burn, his jaw tightening. "She's going straight to pediatric trauma," he said. "Now." David followed, dazed, answering questions he barely heard. Names, ages, allergies. What happened? What happened? Behind him, the cabin buzzed with low voices and raised phones. The story was no longer controlled by a single uniform. It belonged to everyone now. Airport security entered next. Not rushing, not shouting, just walking directly toward Tiffany Miller. "Ma'am," one of them said, "we need you to come with us." Tiffany stiffened. "This is unnecessary," she snapped. "There's been a misunderstanding." "Maybe," the officer replied calmly, "but we'll sort that out on the ground." She looked toward the cockpit, searching for rescue. None came. The captain avoided her eyes. The junior flight attendant stared at the floor. As Tiffany was escorted off, phones followed her every step. By the time passengers deplaned, the footage was already spreading. 3 angles. Clear audio. One slow-motion clip showing the pause before the spill, the moment of choice. By nightfall, Apex Airways' public relations team was in full crisis mode. By morning, the airline had issued a statement. "We are aware of the incident involving a passenger and are conducting a full investigation." But investigations move slower than the internet. The video didn't need commentary. It spoke for itself. The pause, the lean, the lie. News outlets picked up within hours. Morning shows, evening panels, social media outrage. The headline repeated everywhere. "Flight attendant accused of deliberately burning infant in first class." Tiffany was placed on immediate unpaid suspension. 2 days later, she was arrested. The charge, aggravated assault on a minor. In the courtroom, the uniform was gone. No badge. No authority. No aisle to control. Just a woman in a gray blazer, sitting alone at the defense table, staring straight ahead as the footage played on a large screen behind her. Every pause was magnified. Every expression dissected. Her lawyer argued accident, turbulence, misinterpretation. Then Arthur Sterling took the stand. He spoke without emotion, without embellishment. He described exactly what he saw, when he saw it, and why it mattered. He explained escalation patterns, abuse of authority, how power disguises intent. Then came the junior flight attendant. Hands shaking, voice barely steady. "She told me to step away," the young woman testified. "She said she'd handle it." David testified last. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply held up photographs of Maya's bandaged leg and said, "This is what happened when I trusted someone to do their job." The courtroom was silent. The verdict came faster than anyone expected. Guilty. Sentencing followed weeks later. Tiffany Miller received 18 months in state prison, followed by a permanent ban from airline employment and mandatory inclusion on the Federal Aviation Misconduct Registry. Her career ended in a single sentence. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. "Do you regret what happened?" She didn't answer. Inside a pediatric recovery ward across town, Maya took her first pain-free steps months later. The scar would fade. The memory wouldn't. David held his daughter and watched her laugh, a sound he once feared he'd never hear again. Justice hadn't erased the trauma, but it had named it. And for the first time since boarding Flight 4002, David felt something unexpected settle into his chest. Relief. For Tiffany Miller, mornings no longer smelled of coffee and polished floors. They smelled of disinfectant and stale air. Prison didn't care about seniority. It didn't care about uniforms. It didn't care about entitlement or badges earned over decades. Here, authority was irrelevant. Influence dissolved into nothing more than whispered grudges and survival strategies. She woke to the shrill alarm, the sound cutting through her dreams like a blade. Dreams of first-class cabins, the hum of luxury jets, the heads turning in admiration as she walked the aisle. Those memories, once her sanctuary, now mocked her. They reminded her of the power she had lost in a single, terrible decision. Tiffany's identity had been inseparable from her work. Flight attendant, senior staff, enforcer of rules, keeper of first-class decorum. But as she walked through the prison yard, gray walls surrounding her, the uniform replaced by a dull jumpsuit, she realized something she had never allowed herself to admit. Her power had never been hers at all. It had always been granted by perception, by fear, by the obedience of others. Take those away, and there was nothing left. The other inmates stared at her with curiosity and caution. They had no idea who she was outside these walls, and she could offer no intimidation that mattered here. Gossip spread, but it was irrelevant. Outside, headlines screamed. Inside, survival depended on silence and strategy. Tiffany found herself alone, constantly reminded that the skill she had relied on for decades, intimidation, was ineffective. Letters arrived occasionally. Legal updates. Appeals denied. The media continued to cover her story, transforming her from a feared figure into a cautionary tale. Memes circulated on social media. Headlines replayed the coffee incident in every iteration imaginable. Every post, every retelling chipped away at the remnants of dignity she had clung to. Public shame became a constant companion, more suffocating than any cell. At night, Tiffany often lay awake, haunted by a recurring image. The infant screaming, the coffee, the aisle, the silent witness in C2B. Arthur Sterling's calm voice, the testimony, the unwavering gaze of the court. She had been unprepared for the ripple effect of a single moment, a moment she had believed would assert her authority, but had instead exposed her entire character to the world. Even the prison routines reminded her of what she had lost. Meals and trays, unchosen schedules, the strict hierarchy enforced by those who had no reason to respect her previous life. She realized too late that her arrogance, once her armor, had become her weapon against herself. In her mind, she replayed the flight endlessly, seeing the choice she had made over and over. Each time, the consequences stretched further. Each time, the humiliation deepened. Tiffany had wanted control. She had wanted respect. She had wanted to assert dominance in a world she deemed inferior. Instead, she had received irrelevance, exposure, and shame. Every visitor's gaze in court, every camera flash, every headline reminded her. The kingdom she had built was an illusion, fragile and fleeting. And now, stripped of everything that had defined her, Tiffany Miller had nothing but the cold truth that karma had arrived, patient, meticulous, and unforgiving. Years passed. Time, patient and relentless, worked quietly, reshaping lives and perspectives. Tiffany Miller's story had faded from daily headlines, but not from memory, certainly not from those who had witnessed it firsthand. Meanwhile, David Washington had rebuilt a life defined not by trauma, but by resilience. He moved through the world differently now, carrying both grief and gratitude, the two intertwined like threads of a tapestry. Maya, now walking and talking in full sentences, often ran ahead in the park or laughed from the playground. Her resilience a silent testament to her father's devotion. David never forgot that flight, the terror in his child's cries, the disbelief in Tiffany's eyes when her authority finally crumbled. But he also didn't dwell on hatred. Anger, he realized, is only as lasting as one allows it to be. Instead, he used the memory as a compass, guiding him toward empathy, awareness, and vigilance. He became quiet but observant, a man shaped by witnessing cruelty, but determined to never mirror it. Tiffany, on the other hand, had changed in ways neither she nor the world had expected. Prison had stripped her of the trappings of status, leaving her with only herself. She learned humility the hard way, a lesson forged in monotony, routine, and constant surveillance. Public shame had etched itself into her consciousness. Her previous arrogance, once so effortless, became a memory she couldn't quite reconcile with the reality of her diminished life. Out in the world, Tiffany returned one day, free but diminished. She walked through streets that no longer whispered her name in awe. Airlines refused employment. Former colleagues avoided eye contact. Social media, once a distant tool, reminded her daily of her infamy. Reposts, memes, discussions about the flight attendant who spilled coffee on a baby. Even strangers recognized her, sometimes whispering, sometimes recording, always judging. The kingdom she had once ruled now existed only in stories told by others, distorted, scornful, merciless. And then, one ordinary morning, fate began its quiet work. Tiffany entered a diner, the kind with checkered floors, the smell of fried eggs lingering in the air, and the hum of small-town conversation surrounding her. She wanted nothing more than anonymity, a simple cup of coffee, and the illusion of normalcy. The waitress greeted her politely, nothing more, nothing less, and she slid into a booth at the corner. David Washington was there too. Coincidence, or perhaps the universe weaving its threads tighter. He sat alone, absorbed in a newspaper and a cup of coffee, Maya at his side, drawing quietly in a sketchbook. His presence was unassuming, grounded, unaware, yet Tiffany felt it immediately. It was not just recognition. It was a subtle, undeniable reminder that some moments, some people, leave marks that time cannot erase. Her heart quickened, a mix of fear, shame, and the faintest flicker of nostalgia. Tiffany considered leaving, but the diner was small. Movement would be noticed. And deep down, she felt a strange, magnetic pull, a silent demand that the moment she had tried to erase, ignore, or rewrite must now be faced. David glanced up from his newspaper, as if sensing her presence. Their eyes met across the room. No words were exchanged. No gestures were needed. Everything unspoken hung in the air. Memory, justice, reckoning. Tiffany felt the weight of years, the crushing burden of consequences, fully realized. This wasn't the courtroom. This wasn't prison. But it was a place where karma could quietly, inexorably, make itself known. Maya giggled at a doodle she had made, tugging David's hand. He smiled, eyes briefly flicking toward Tiffany before returning to his daughter. That simple act, a father's love untainted, resilient, pure, was a stark contrast to the life Tiffany had once imposed upon him, a life she had tried to control and dominate. And in that contrast, Tiffany felt a jolt, a recognition of the reality she had created for herself and the lives she had impacted. Years of arrogance, entitlement, and cruelty had brought her here. Years of grief, courage, and patience had brought him here. And in this quiet diner, in this ordinary moment, the universe began to balance itself in ways that were subtle, profound, and unavoidable. Tiffany could sense it, even if she could not yet name it. The circle was closing, the story was nearing its final act, and her reckoning, long delayed, meticulously calculated, was ready to arrive. Tiffany sat frozen, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee, eyes locked on David and Maya. The world had become painfully still, each second stretching longer than she could bear. Time, relentless and patient, had carried her here, to a moment she had once thought impossible. The little girl, laughing softly, unaware of the chaos her father had endured years ago, was a living testament to resilience. Every giggle, every bright glance, was a quiet rebuke of Tiffany's arrogance. David noticed her only briefly, a flicker of recognition in his calm eyes. No anger. No vengeance. Just awareness. He saw her for what she was now, a woman diminished, exposed, human in ways that uniform, authority, and years of entitlement had never allowed. There was no shouting, no accusation. Karma had not needed theatrics. It had been methodical, patient, undeniable. Tiffany's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to explain, to justify the unthinkable. But no words could undo the past. The coffee spill, the screams, the courtroom, the headlines, they weren't moments she could edit, replay, or delete. They existed outside her control, as permanent and visible as scars on a child's leg. And now, in this small diner, they hung in the air like a weight she had no strength to bear. David rose, gathering Maya's drawings, ready to leave. Tiffany's heart hammered in her chest, knowing this was her final chance, a moment that had arrived without warning, orchestrated by the universe rather than intention. Yet, she said nothing. Even the words that came to her lips felt hollow. She realized with an unbearable clarity that the true lesson of her life was not punishment, not shame, but recognition. Power is fleeting, kindness endures, and cruelty always finds its witness. As they walked past her, David offered a brief nod, not accusatory, not victorious, just human, calm, and steady. Maya waved without fully understanding the gravity of what had passed. Tiffany watched them go, the weight of years of arrogance and entitlement pressing down like the heavy air of a grounded plane. And she knew in that instant that karma is not theatrical. It is quiet. It is patient. It is complete. The diner returned to its hum, the smell of eggs and coffee filling the space once more. Tiffany remained seated, alone, reflecting on the life she had lost and the consequences she had earned. The lesson was simple, brutal, and undeniable. Those who wield power with cruelty may command attention for a time, but in the end, the universe always balances the scales. And sometimes it does so with the quiet precision of a father's patience and a child's resilience, leaving the guilty to stare in silent, inescapable recognition.